All right, so today we'll be discussing a very important but also a very intriguing chapter in the Bible. And as you can see on the screen, we'll be going over Hebrews chapter 7. Um, as you can see, I believe there are 28 verses in this chapter. And so I will do my best to make it concise, but at the same time, very comprehensible at the same time. And so I want to give praises and honor to the Most High for this opportunity to do this teaching. Um, Before I even go any further, I just want to be brutally honest. This subject matter or this topic or this chapter, someone can literally write a book on this chapter and still would not cover everything essentially of what this chapter is trying to convey. And so me making a 20-minute, 30-minute video on this chapter, the saying, the touching the tip of the iceberg. I'm not even going to touch a millimeter of the iceberg today, but it's still not a bad thing because the purpose of teaching, in my opinion, and as it relates to the scriptures, is that you want to get your audience, whether it be one person, two persons, or 10 persons, or 1,000 persons, get them to the point where they are autonomous in understanding. So essentially, you want to teach them how to fish. And so if you're able to teach them how to fish, they're not so reliant on you for every and everything as it relates to the scriptures of understanding. And I think nowadays a lot of people teach in a manner where you're attached to this particular person or individuals to get everything, and that's not how it's designed. You want to teach a person how to fish. And so essentially, if you teach them how to fish, to catch 5 to 10 fishes a day, guess what? 10 years down the road, they may be able to catch 20 to 50, fish a day. And then their children may be able to catch 100 fish a day. So essentially, you want to edify them to a point where it evolves, where they're able to do more with the fundamentals that they were taught. And that way, everybody is blessed and edified and never stagnant. You're constantly growing, but essentially, you have learned the fundamentals. And so that's how I try to approach when I teach on the scriptures, from that standpoint of just teaching the people how to fish. So if we don't get through everything today, it is absolutely fine. The hard work or the homework comes in you and the individual of doing your own research, and that way you can know for yourself and you're not just taking a biased point of view. You have a well-rounded understanding on, and so therefore when it's time to interpret or teach others, you will be able to do so adequately. All right. That being said, so we're gonna do Hebrews 7. Now, Hebrews, by most scholarship, or I should say traditional scholarship, the author is Paul or Shaul, considered to be the author of the book. And, some scholars say that is Barnabas, and or an unknown writer. But today, the purpose of this teaching, we're gonna just go with Paul, as that being the general consensus as the author of the book. And some may say, why is that important? You will see in a second. And we're gonna start off with Second Peter chapter 3. And just bear with me because it's very important. There's certain prerequisites uh, that we have to go through before we can even tackle this chapter. It's very, very important. I'm going to go to Second Peter chapter 3 and show you the reason why. This may be redundant for many, but brand new for many as well. So for the sake of those who may not know or familiar with this chapter or these verses that I'm going to expound upon, this will be very interesting. All right. So this is Second Peter chapter 3, starting with verse 14. Therefore, beloved, since you are waiting for these, be diligent to be found by him without spot or blemish and at peace, and count the patience of our Lord as salvation, just as our beloved brother Paul, who also wrote to you according to the wisdom given him, as he does in all his letters. I believe in the KJV you may find epistles, which is the same thing. Epistles are just letters. When he speaks in them of these matters. Now listen to this. There are some things in them that are hard to understand, which the ignorant and unstable twist to their own destruction as they do the other scriptures. Now I'm going to pause right there. I'm just going to expound upon this. If you look to the right of the screen here, you'll see the date and time. So today is May 5th, 2018, approximately 9:25 p.m. And let's just go back 25 years ago, okay? Which seems like yesterday, but a long time ago. The world was totally different than it is today. And those who are older enough could attest to that, okay? Now let's go back 25 more years, which would be about 50 years ago, which would be my parents' generation or uncles and aunts' generation. The world back then was drastically different today. And I'm not even talking just in technology. I'm talking just society, culturally, morally, just people were just totally different. All right. Now, if you go back 100 years ago, again, it's going to be drastically different. Now, Second Peter, or the entire New Testament, was written essentially 2,000 years ago. Now, if you follow that same premise or that timeline, now think about how different things were back 2,000 years ago. We're talking about not a whole different planet. We're talking a whole different universe. All right. Why is this important? How this relates to Hebrews 7? Because Peter was boots on the ground, so to speak. They were living out history. Right now, 2,000 years later, we're trying to ascertain this history that they were living out. Peter had direct access and communication to Yeshua, Jesus himself. All the emissaries did. So their understanding, in my opinion, would be the most purest and authentic understanding, as in contrast as today. It doesn't mean that we can't understand. What I'm saying, to put it in context, is that they had the most purest understanding because they were living out what we're reading right now. And so if Peter says that there are some things that are hard to understand, referring to Shaul, Paul's epistles, his letters, too hard to understand, when someone today comes to me and said they understand Paul's epistles, like, they know everything it is to be inside out, I know that they're deceived. I know that that's an arrogant and individual that is full of pride. Because if Peter didn't understand Paul or found it difficult in some of his writings, then there's no way we 2,000 years later can have a better understanding than these people. Our best thing is to have equal or get close understanding to what they had, because they were living in that time period. And so when we approach Hebrews 7, we must understand that we cannot approach it in a way like a regular book you just pick up and start reading. All right. And I'm going to go on to the latter part of the verse, and which the ignorant, ignorant, I think in the KJV you'll find unlearned, if I remember correctly, but ignorant, unlearned, unstable, twist to their own destruction, as they do the other scriptures. So and by the way, when they're referring to the word scriptures in the New Testament, the New Testament was not around, technically speaking, or canonized as the 27 books to about as we have now to about 300 plus years later from this time. So when they're referring to the scriptures, they're referring to what many will call the Old Testament, or I would refer to as the Hebrew scriptures or the Tanakh or the Torah. That is what they're referring to, because the New Testament was not published in vastness as it is now. So they didn't have the New Testament at the time when Peter, or the author of Second Peter, was writing this text. So which means that if you don't understand the Hebrew scriptures or the Old Testament, there's a good chance you're going to twist this man's letters, and it's going to be to your own destruction. So, to put it in another way, Paul's letters, and today we're discussing Hebrews 7. Let's put it in the analogy of math, right? Calculus, trigonometry, the different types of algebra, geometry, different angles, and that is considered advanced math, And to get to that, you have to go through stages, to do algebra, you have to take pre-algebra. I remember doing that. I had to take pre-algebra, I believe in 7th or 8th grade, if I'm not mistaken. And then I think in 9th grade, we did algebra. I don't even remember. Then you had algebra 1, then you had algebra 2. And, you work your way up, okay? In order to do pre-algebra or even algebra or calculus, you have to know how to do addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. If you don't have a fundamental understanding of those 4 principles or concepts in subtraction, addition, multiplication, and division, you're not able to do calculus. If you do, you're going to get the answer wrong every time. And so when we read Second Peter, that's what the writer is essentially trying to convey, or one of the things, in my opinion, that he's trying to convey. That when it comes to Paul's letters, listen, you got to know your fundamentals. And if you don't have a proper understanding of the Tanakh, the Old Testament, you're going to be confused and you're going to be misguided. And so whenever I approach, again, Paul's epistles or even the New Testament, I always emphasize it's important to understand the Tanakh. And if you don't, you cannot fast forward to the New Testament. Many people just go to the New Testament, essentially, which is the back of the book, and read a couple of lines, and that's it, which don't make any sense. And I'm going to go very quickly. This is Bible Hub, and this is just a quick timeline. I'm not going to go through in detail. You could just look here, BibleHub.com/timeline. I'm a great resource. If you're not familiar, very great resource you should have. Anyway, so here's a timeline. These are approximate dates. And we're going to start with 4000 BC, time of the beginning, the creation. And I'm going to fast forward to the time of the New Testament. And again, just bear with me. This is very important. This is definitely a prerequisite that we must understand. So before the New Testament is 430 BC, which is approximately a difference of what? 3600 years. Okay? So the Tanakh, or the Old Testament, covers from about 4000 BC to 430 BC. So essentially 4,000 years rounded up. Okay? Very important to understand. And in dealing with BC or BCE or AM, you count backwards. So so 430, you're going backwards, okay? And AD, you go forward. All right, if that makes sense. All right. Now, the New Testament, according to this timeline, again, this is approximates. You have John the Baptist about 6 BC born, and then you have the time of Revelation, 95 AD. And if you add that up, that's about 100 years. Okay? 100 years, and then you have essentially nearly 4,000 years, 36, roughly 4,000 years. So when you take one verse out of the New Testament and you trump the Old Testament, logically, it don't even make any sense. There's too much history that is involved in the Tanakh to do that. The New Testament just covers basically 100 years of a certain event or dispensation in time. Very, very important to understand. So again, I'm only emphasizing this is because this is never emphasized enough. You just open the Bible, start reading, and don't have a clue what you're reading, or don't have or understand what you're reading, is, to me, very dangerous. Because if you don't understand what you're reading, essentially, you have to rely on somebody else's opinion about everything. But it's important to understand these fundamental facts about the Bible. So when someone takes one verse, again, I'm just going to, not to be redundant, take one verse out of the New Testament, and I'm not even referring to Hebrews 7. I'm just saying in a generic sense, to say that this means this. You can't. It logically, it sounds crazy. There has to be more to it. All right. So the understanding of this scripture is very, very vital. When I mean scripture, I'm referring to the Tanakh, the Old Testament, to understanding what the author is trying to convey in Hebrews chapter 7. All right. And I can go further more and more, but for the sake of the video, I don't want to go too far off. But I just think it's very important that we always keep that in mind when we are approaching the epistles of Paul or the New Testament, that so we would have a healthier respect in ascertaining or parsing the words that we're reading. All right, so we're going to start with verse 1. And it says, for this is referring to Melchizedek, the priestly order of Melchizedek, as you can see, is the subject matter. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, and Salem is basically Jerusalem, or in Hebrew, Jerusalem, same thing. This king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. Now, the key to unlocking the meaning of Hebrews 7, or one of the keys, is that we got to understand who Melchizedek is. And to some degree, he's a mysterious individual in some sense. There's people heard of the name, but just there's not a lot of information about who Melchizedek is. Because as you can see in verse 11, if I'm not mistaken, you'll find now the context is Jesus compared to Melchizedek. The contrast with Melchizedek and Jesus. So in order to understand that, we got to understand who Melchizedek is. Again, going back to the Tanakh. You can't bypass that. All right. So that being said, we're going to go to Joshua chapter 10. And we're not going to be long in Joshua 10, but this is very important. All right. It says Joshua 10, verse 1. And now Adonizedek, very important. Remember this name, or I should say title. My computer is acting up. Anyway, Adonai-Zedek. I'm just going to read verse 1 briefly and verse 2 because you find the name Adonai-Zedek. Okay? Adonai-Zedek, king of Jerusalem or Jerusalem. As you can see here, the latter part, you'll find the word Salem. Same name here, Salem. So Jerusalem, Jerusalem, Salem, same thing, okay? Adonai-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had taken, and by the way, Joshua is, well, let me not even open up another door, okay? But in contrast to Hebrews 7, technically speaking, Joshua is the English translation of Jesus into English, because same thing. All right. So, which is, and we're discussing Hebrews 7 with Melchizedek and Jesus compared. So, Joshua is more of a closer translation of his Hebrew name, Yehoshua. All right. So Adonai-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua, and obviously this is not referring to Jesus, but the name is what I'm just emphasizing. Okay. This is a different character. All right. I'm not saying that this Joshua in that time was Yeshua Jesus of Nazareth in first century. Just saying that the transliteration of the name Joshua is the closest translation to his actual real name. And it's just, kind of funny how everything parallel and we're talking about Melchizedek. But anyway, don't want to go off again. Very easy to do that, so forgive me. All right, now Adonai-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had taken Ai and totally destroyed it, and doing to Ai as king as he had done to Jericho and its king, and the people of Gibeon had made a treaty for peace with Israel and had become their allies. Okay, I'm going to fast forward to verse 3. I'm just going to read the first part of it. So Adonai-Zedek, king of Jerusalem. All right, remember this term Adonai, or this title Adonai-Zedek, because it's going to come in handy. Now I'm going to go down a little further to verse 12 and 13. On that day, the Lord gave the Amorites over to Israel. Joshua said to the Lord in the presence of Israel, sun, stand still over Gibeon, and you, moon, over the valley of Ajalon. And the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, till the nation avenged itself on its enemies, as it is written in the book of Jasher. Okay. 2 Samuel, 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 18. It says, again, you're probably wondering what this have to do with Hebrews 7. It all ties together. Again, we have to go through the different steps before we get to calculus. Okay. Verse 18, sorry. Also, he bade them teach the children of Judah to use the bow. Behold, it is written in the book of Jasher. Now, Samuel and Joshua, in terms of chronologically, was written in different period, 100 years apart. So clearly there was a book at that time that was considered scripture to be the book of Jasher. Hebrew, the word is Yasher, which means upright. So there was a book around that the author, Samuel and Joshua, and the Israelites knew to be the book of Jasher. And we're going to go here to the book of Jasher, chapter 16. And before I go, let me just say a few things about the book of Jasher, because there's a lot of debate, a lot of controversy surrounding the book of Jasher, because it's not in the traditional 66 books of the Bible. Now, many people know there are missing books of the Bible. I think most people would agree that there are books that were, missing, or some books that were taken out, etc., etc. And this is what I'm saying about the book of Jasher. And this is very important that you understand this. the question is this book inspired as the rest of the scriptures? Okay, that is the ultimate question when approaching the book of Jasher. I'm not saying that it is. I'm not saying that it's not. That is up to you as the individual to do your own research to come to your understanding, which is very important, because anyone can give their opinion and give a couple of verses to point in either direction, whether to validate or to invalidate their opinion. So it's up to the individual to do their own research objectively to whether they see Jasher as a credible source to use. Because remember, when approaching the scriptures, it's a puzzle. We were not around at the time. So we have to use, in my opinion, all the puzzles and resources that we have that go back to that time period. Okay? And the book of Jasher, in my opinion, there are some things that people say in regards to history that may not be accurate. There's a lot of valuable information in the book of Jasher that connects a lot of things before that I would scratch my head to, that when I'm like, it didn't make any sense. I read the book of Jasher on certain things and I'm like, okay, wow, it makes a lot more sense now. And so from the standpoint of this video, that's how I'm approaching the book of Jasher. I'm not telling you to bang out to it in terms of saying that you have to use the book of Jasher. No, all I'm saying for the sake of this video, because again, we want to approach Hebrews 7 exegetically. We want to put all the pieces to the puzzle that we can so we can understand it. So we don't have to rely on a man's word to teach us. Okay. And what I mean by man's word, that we don't have to, we can be autonomous in fishing, so to speak. We don't have to keep on, we want to get to the point where we can understand the basics and then we can take that and implement it in everyday life. All right. So this is what the book of Jasher says in verse 11. It says, and Adonizedek, remember, same name here, king of Jerusalem, the same was Shem, went out with his men to meet Abram and his people with bread and wine, and they remained together in the valley of Melech. And Adonizedek blessed Abram, and Abram gave him a tenth from all that he had brought from the spoil of his enemies. For Adonizedek was priest before God. Now, this sounds very, very familiar, because if we go to Genesis 10, let's go to Genesis 14. Genesis 14, verse 18. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High, and blessed Abram, saying, blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and praise be the God of the Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. Okay? Sounds familiar, right? Adonizedek, this book of Jasher, verse 11, 12. Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, the same was Shem, went out with his men to meet Abram and his people with bread and wine, and they remained together in the valley of Melech. And Adonizedek blessed Abram. Abram gave him tenth of all he had and brought forth the spoil of enemies, for Adonizedek was a priest before God. So clearly, according to the text here in the book of Jasher, and I'm emphasizing the book of Jasher, according to the book of Jasher, Adonizedek is the same person as Melchizedek. Not only that, Adonizedek, remember Adonizedek and Melchizedek is more of a title than a name. The actual person or the name of the person is Shem. Now, I'm not saying something, all right, let me be clear. I'm not saying that Shem is Melchizedek or not Melchizedek. I'm saying according to the text, Shem is Adonizedek, which is Melchizedek, or Melchizedek is Adonizedek. And essentially, the person that we are referring to is Shem, which is the son of Noah. Okay? I'm going to probably make this part 1 before we get to Melchizedek, because this is I want to touch on some things in Wikipedia. So we will I'm gonna pause here because again, all right, so far, again, I want to point out is that Melchizedek is key, essential, and imperative to understand who this person was that we're referring to. So when it's contrast with Yeshua, Jesus, it will all make more sense, if that makes sense. So I'm going slow on purpose in this particular part 1, just so if you're not aware, so when we get to part 2, we're going to go a little bit faster, but this is just basic addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, because part 2, part 3, Hebrews 7 is calculus, it is trigonometry, and it's important that we don't skip any steps. So forgive me if you may find out when we're going to get to the meat and bones of it. This is very, very important because I don't believe there's a proper understanding that is being taught today. And so this is part 1. Shalom.